May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. Today's passage from Luke might surprise you that for this first Sunday in Advent. I'm sure it didn't take you long to discern that the church's season of Advent was not created by the fine folks at Hallmark. There are no flirty fireside chats, there are no magical snowfalls or dreamy couple getaways. Instead, we find cosmic catastrophe, fear, and foreboding. It seems as if there's peril at every turn in this gospel reading, and yet Jesus' sentiment throughout calls for alertness and prayer, not fear. Be alert at all times, verse 36 reads, the hope being that all of Jesus' followers will trust in God's salvation and have confidence in God's complete and total redemption of the world. Jesus comes to us, as you know, to create a whole new world order, one that turns present society's order upside down and inside out. It's a world where hope can be found even in that which appears to be unredeemable. And that's what makes today's reading apocalyptic. You see, in Greek, apocalypse means an uncovering or an unveiling. And Jesus is pulling back, uncovering that blanket of despair, which would ordinarily come from these non-Hallmark places of rubble and pain and grief. And instead, Jesus transforms these places into places of hope and new life. One of the tools that the church has for entering into this apocalyptic unveiling during Advent is a tool which is almost exclusively reserved for our season of Lent, and most especially for the days during Holy Week. And it's the Stations of the Cross. Now I know, stay with me here. This is probably the first time you've heard anybody bring up Stations of the Cross during Advent. And for those of you who may not know, the stations narrate the 14 stops, or stations as they're called, key moments from the time that Jesus was condemned to death till the time that they laid him in the tomb. And one of my favorite modern theologians, Irishman Padraig Tuama, a Catholic, he shares how for 10 years, every single day, yes, every single day, including the days of Advent, he meditated on these stations of the cross, these 14 stations. And he noted emphatically that there are 14 stations, not 15. There is no station which acknowledges the empty tomb or Jesus' resurrection. The idea, he says, is to find hope where there appears to be only hopelessness. To find courage where there seems to be only despair. To find strength where there seems to be only weakness. And admittedly, he says, there's no pretense about Jesus' abduction, torture, and murder, that they're anything but abduction, torture, and murder. But even in those places, we can still discover some kind of hope. The hope that comes from protest. The hope that comes of truth-telling, the hope of gesture, the hope of generosity. And in the same way, in today's gospel, Jesus is pointing us to the fact that when the world is crumbling, the apocalyptic God is still at work pulling back that blanket of darkness for the good and for the redemption of all creation. Now, this made me think of a time years ago when a friend of mine's father died far too young from cancer. And I went with her to the funeral and then to the burial at the church cemetery afterwards. And after the ashes had been placed in the grave and the final words of commendation were spoken, everyone else returned to the parish hall for a lunch. But my friend didn't follow the crowd. She stood there looking at the grave where she had placed her father's ashes, and she just couldn't bring herself to leave. So I stayed too. And after a while, she realized that what was keeping her there was that she couldn't bear to bring herself to leave until that grave had been filled in. So we looked around, but there was nothing there to help us with that hole in the ground. There was no shovel, no trowel. We had nothing but 2 sets of hands willing to get dirty. So together we took handful after handful of dirt from the mound beside the grave, and we started to fill it in. Now, make no mistake about it, this was a complete time of devastation for my friend, saying goodbye to a way too young and beloved father. And yet the two of us together turned that moment of utter grief into an expression or an action of faith and hope. The dirt on our hands, even that dirt that was caked into our fingernails, told the truth that death was very real indeed, but it was also an act of faith to walk alongside each other and to embody encouragement for one another and to trust in the hope of life everlasting, which is central to our tradition. Now, just like everyone else here, my life too has had more than its fair share of pain and suffering. And as a priest, during those times, I have to say that people often come up to me and say, "Oh, it must be your faith in God that gets you through." Well, this is hard for me to hear because I know what my response ought to be. It should be a resounding yes. My faith in God should be what gets me through, but it's not. At least not in that way. You see, faith described in this type of statement is a noun. It's a type of faith that says, I believe this, and this. I believe in God, the creator of heaven and earth, or I believe in the resurrection from the dead and life everlasting. The faith of our creeds. But this is definitely not the faith which sustains me through difficult times. Rather, it's faith as a verb, as an act of gathering, as an act of giving, as an act of serving others, as an act of loving others who are different from me, as an act of protest, as an act of getting my hands dirty with your hands. That's the faith which saves me. And that's the faith which enables me and enables all of us to keep putting one foot in front of the other when the world around us looks too dark, too scary, too jagged to go on. This is the faith that Jesus is saying protects and secures and sustains us all. The gist of today's gospel is that there is always the promise of hope, even in a world that is riddled with uncertainty and injustice and conflict and pain and fear. And no matter how chaotic our world may be, Jesus promises his return will bring about lasting salvation and justice and redemption and healing. And this small flickering light right here on our Advent wreath, which will grow and grow each week during this month until Christmas, changes everything. Because Jesus changes everything. So do not despair when your hands are caked with dirt, either literally or figuratively, or your heart trembles from the sights and the sounds of the earth in distress. The arrival of Jesus among us, whenever and however it happens, is a word of profound hope. So this Advent, pay attention to the apocalypse right before our very eyes. It's an unveiling of God's saving, redeeming, and life-saving grace. Amen.